Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. When we invited today's speaker, we didn't realize we'd have to compete with Super Bowl this afternoon, but I can assure you, you've chosen the more erudite and illuminating event. We're extremely fortunate that Griselda Pollock could join us from England on the occasion of the opening of Alina Szapocznikow, Sculpture Undone, 1955 to 1972, the exhibition that's now on view in the galleries upstairs. Our speaker is one of the most influential scholars of modern, postmodern, and contemporary art, and is internationally known for her work on feminist studies in the visual arts and cultural theory. She is professor of the social and critical histories of art and director for Center of Cultural Analysis, History, and Theory at the University of Leeds. Her expansive fields of research include cinema and culture in the modern era, trauma and aesthetics, the Holocaust and cultural memory, femininity, representation and modernity, and gender and the museum. Her writings include in-depth readings of the work of a range of artists, from Vincent van Gogh, Jean-François Millet, and Mary Cassatt, all the way to Eva Hesse. And her most recent publications, and I'm not going to list all her publications, it would take the entire hour of our lecture, but her most recent publications include the first monograph on the painter Bracha Ettinger, titled Art as Compassion, co-edited with Catherine de Zeger. She also edited a collection on concentrationary cinema with Max Silverman, and she has completed a monograph on artist Charlotte Salomon. Her current work focuses on art as a form of inscription and transformation of traumatic legacies, and will appear in the forthcoming publication After Images, After Effects, Trauma and Aesthetics, Inscription, Encryption in the Virtual Feminist Museum. Most importantly, in relation to the exhibition on view upstairs, Griselda Pollock is one of the earliest advocates of Alina Szapocznikows' work outside of Poland, and indeed a fundamental resource for any of us looking at Szapocznikows' art today. She contributed a deeply insightful paper to the book Awkward Objects, that's actually available in our bookstore upstairs, that was published in conjunction with the symposium on the artist held at the Museum of Modern Art in Warsaw in 2009. The title of her lecture today is Too Early and Too Late, The Sculptural Dissolutions of Alina Szapocznikow in and Out of Time. So please join me in welcoming Griselda Pollock.
Thank you very much indeed, Allegra, for that warm and extensive introduction. I always have to live up to it. It's one of the trials of having worked in one's field for so long. The legacy kind of haunts you, so every event is another opportunity for engaging freshly with new work and with a new audience. So I'm extremely delighted and would like to thank Allegra for inviting me here, and also to congratulate Allegra Pesanti and Elena Filipovic and Joanna Mitowska and Connie Butler for having had the courage and the foresight and the initiative and the success in bringing this exhibition of Alina Szapocznikow to the United States to allow audiences who are as astute and well-informed and eager to understand the full range of the history of art as this audiences in Los Angeles, Columbus, Ohio, and New York will certainly be. They have written very beautifully in the catalogue about the drawings, about the role of photography, about the relations that can be established with other artists, and about the history of the reception of Alina Szapocznikow. And I'm going to add my voice to theirs with my own particular range of interests, which, as Allegra introduced it, do include the question of trauma. So I want to begin with a statement by Alina Szapocznikow. Oops. Let me get my lecture out. Now, all scholars working on Alina Szapocznikow are agreed that this oeuvre challenges us to think anew about the body, the subjectivized and the phantasmatic and the indexical body. The body is a form in art, but also the body is the existential site of psychic but also intensely physical experience. Just before she died, aged 46, from excruciatingly painful secondary bone cancer following primary breast cancer that had mutilated her own gendered body, the sculptor Alina Szapocznikow wrote a kind of manifesto about her life commitment to sculpture, and it's in two parts. The first one reads, I have been defeated by the main protagonist, the wonder of our times, the machine. Today, all beauty, the discoveries and testimonies of our times, the recording of history, all belong to the machine. Now, this is in a pre-digital age, so she was still already thinking with only video and tape recorders. True dreams belong to it. It is applauded by the public. I only produce clumsy or awkward objects, in French, objet maladroit. There's a second part. Despite everything, I persist in attempting to fix in resin the imprints of our body. I'm convinced that among all the manifestations of perishability, the human body is the most sensitive, the only source of all joy, all pain, all truth. On the level of consciousness, because of its ontological misery, which is as inevitable as it is unacceptable. Now, this statement remains a touchstone for our understanding of what, at that desperate moment of a prematurely shortened life as the body turned against her own will to live on, Alina Szapocznikow had come to understand the stakes of her artistic practice. The choice facing the artist, according to her in 1971, is to produce objects that lack the formal beauty and technological order of the machine age, emblematic of an inhuman industrial modernity, and to instead exhibit their own deformation as testimony to the ontological, that's to say, ontology is the study of being, the actual existent misery of human corporality, as well as an acute sense of mutability and mortality. This statement of the supremacy of the machine is perhaps not at all surprising at the point at which the concept of sculpture was being so radically expanded, notably by pop art's interruption of the esoteric qualities of minimalism. But I hear something deeper. Szapocznikow creates the first level of opposition between a certain inhuman perfection and its dream of technological order on one hand, and her manufacture, and I stress the hand-making, of badly made, awkward, clumsy objects on the other. Hence, the processes involved in making things sculpturally and by hand are formally different in kind, but also in ethos from remote, machinic things repetitively, systematically produced. Not just a critique of Taylorist production methods, this opposition obliquely refers to what was most new and perhaps most traumatic in the era of modernity, particularly the 20th century, namely the industrialization of death through technological warfare, which was the trauma of the First World War, and through what Hannah Arendt named the mass manufacture of corpses, i.e. industrial factories for genocide, which was the trauma of Nazism and the period of the Second World War. And the continuing threat to humanity lies in the fact that the ethos of that genocidal industrial genocide has persisted into the cultural imaginary that idolizes the machine and forgets the fact of the human condition, which is embodiedness. Now, we easily accept Alina Szapocznikows observations, but do we who had not seen and endured what she had seen and endured understand the full implications of her knowing in her own body at several different times of her very short life what it means to speak of ontological misery and the body as perishable? David Rousset, a French political prisoner deported to Buchenwald, coined the phrase the concentrationary universe to describe the other world, the other planet, created by and in the concentration camps. And Rousseau wrote at the end of his own study, "Normal people do not know that everything is possible. Concentrationees do, and they know it in their muscles." We shall see later the aesthesis of trauma described in comparably physical terms by another French political deportee, Charlotte Delbo. Most of us, normal people, live in a defiant disavowal of our own mortality. Notably, when young, we know we cannot die. The forced encounter with human perishability is traumatic, through sudden bereavement or the diagnosis of a fatal or deadly disease. Exposure to the daily possibility of undeserved death and the witnessing of dying in atrocious conditions sets Alina Szapocznikow, like other survivors of the concentration universe, apart from whatever comfort we, the non-survivors, might draw from the poetics of her text as a statement of the human condition. That phrase evokes, just think that we've gone go this way. That phrase evokes the term that Hannah Arendt used as the title of her book as a sequel to her analysis of the concentration universe, which she considered to be the product of totalitarianism, namely the exercise of total power. And the exercise of total power requires the total destruction of the human being in order for it to recognize itself as total. And after that experiment of total power, Arendt argues that we have to redefine the human condition, or rather the conditions for the continuity of humanity. The concentration and the death camps, which are very different from each other, but I won't go into that here, were in fact novel political laboratories for a systematic dehumanization, for the lived but deadly torture of a still human consciousness who witnessed the attrition of starved, diseased, brutalized bodies until their physiology no longer supported human identity. The camp as a system ultimately rendered human beings, as human beings, superfluous. Witnessing in post-war culture the adulation of technology and mechanical beauty, Szapocznikows work is both a symptomatic registration of the politicization of industrial production to destroy, and a conscious defiance of that force at the deepest level, which played itself out through a lifelong exploration of the relation between handmade inscriptions by a creative body to formulations on paper and in material of things that assert both the body in its totally novel condition of post-Auschwitz perishability. Hence, the sexual body and the dead body are the twin poles within which her work oscillates. Materials enshrine, but also entomb, as well as collide the classic doubling of life and death, pain and pleasure, which has been rendered terrible by the real of the actual historical circumstances, which we, the non-survivors, sentimentally package up in words like camps, atrocity, the Holocaust, without pausing long enough to grasp the implications of those words for all who live and die after them. Now, Alina Szapocznikow did not feel compelled, as some survivors like Primo Levi, to shout out, "Shema," he says, "listen." And if you read that poem when he finally says, "Consider, this has been. I commend these words to you. Engrave them on your hearts when you're in your house, when you're on your way, when you go to bed, and when you rise up. Repeat them to your children. Or may your house crumble, disease render you powerless, and your offspring avert their faces from you." So this sort of thundering mosaic warning was not the style of Alina Szapocznikow. She would not speak in public about her experiences, although in the film that is showing with the exhibition, she appears to have confided some of them in private conversation to the director. But in the film, she does intimate the issue that Jürgen Habermas, a Frankfurt School philosopher, will articulate as the utter unprecedented novelty of the period we call Auschwitz. For despite all the records of human monstrosity, this was the moment of the first complete rupture of the solidarity of all who wear a human face. Likewise, as Alina Szapocznikow asks in sotto voce in the film, how can she comprehend that she belongs to the same species as those who perpetrated what she had endured and seen? She knew that rupture in her muscles. So I would like to invite you to consider Alina Szapocznikows work under the sign of the survivor, who does not have a past, but lives with trauma's distorting presence and presentness, but also under the sign of trauma, where some of that past is known, but also much of it is unknowably horrifying, that is at once imprinted on the body, and without an image or a word to relieve its awful proximity, its evasive occupation of the self. And finally, I suggest we can read it under the sign of aesthetic transformation, that seeks to find forms within which traces of trauma might be transported, digested in mediated doses, and so relieved. But I have found in my research on artists and artworks and this question of aesthetic transformation that it can fail. Attempted disavowal can sometimes lead to what is called encryption, which means turning it into a secret that hides within, and also as if you buried it in a tomb so that it remains undissolved, but simply there, cold and permanent within. And the question, therefore, is what forces shape the trajectory of Alina Szapocznikow sculpture, oscillating between her conscious, reflective, attentive relation to the work around her in her own various contexts, for art in Prague first, and then in Paris, and then in Warsaw, and again in Prague, in Paris, and what was the pressure of the unprecedented experience beyond the limits of known worlds that is not a small matter of an outrageous biography that we repeat in awed tones, but rather her individuated and artistic register of the major human catastrophe of the 20th century, a catastrophe to the human condition. Adorno, in his various meditations on philosophy and life, as well as aesthetics after Auschwitz, declared that that which had happened changed the conditions of human dying and hence living for all. And Habermas again, Auschwitz altered the conditions for the continuation of historical life, and not only in Germany. So, starting with my manifesto, I ask, what are the conditions for her aesthetic and philosophical position? Are they purely personal? Are they historical? Are they evidence of a sense of aesthetic practice as a means to struggle against the encryption of an unmovable traumatic burden, at once intensely experienced in the artist's own body, and yet of a truly historical order of catastrophe that had to be made part of culture? And how would we trace this in the actual works we see around us in the exhibition? So I want to start at the end of her career in 1973, and I shall then consider how and why she's been embraced by the international art world 40 years on, and then I shall offer my own reading of the curious trajectory of her work, from solid to fluid or dissolving forms, from vertical to horizontal, under the sign of encrypted trauma, and I want to set the project of the sculptured body into the larger context of survivorship and the changing Western image of death, a Christian image forced to yield before the reality of mass dying, of a mass Jewish death that was, via the concentrationary, a rupture in all human dying. After her death in France on the 2nd of March 1973, when she was aged 46 from secondary bone cancer, art critic Pierre Restany organized a posthumous exhibition at the Musée Moderne de la Ville de Paris of Alina Szapocznikows most recent works, which were two series called Tumors, 1969-71, and Herbarium of 1971. You see the cover of the exhibition. Now, the first series of objects, which you can see on the cover, were made from clothes and papers rolled into rough lumpen forms and bathed in polyester resins which set hard, laid on the ground or against beds of pebbles. They seemed to reference the deadly growths of spreading cancer that would take the life of a woman who had already fought off virtually untreatable peritoneal tuberculosis in 1949-50, only surviving by means of an experimental dosage of streptomycin, but which left her infertile. After having survived the German invasions of Poland in 1939, when she was 13, and as a result of being Jewish, this led to incarceration in two ghettos, Pabianice, February 1940-42, and then Łódź, May 1942. We think she was then transported via Auschwitz, although this is undocumented, to the notorious and newly built concentration camp of Bergen-Belsen in Germany for 10 months. Belsen is where Anna Frank died in 1945. Then she was possibly returned from there to the ghetto of Theresienstadt, which appears to have been her location from the autumn of 44 till May 1945. She was liberated aged 19 on the 7th of May 1945, imagining herself as the sole survivor of her entire family. Her mother had been separated from her in 1944, and her brother, lost sight of in 1939, is known to have died in Terezin on the 15th of January 1945. It is therefore obvious that the terrible irony of imminent and excruciating premature death from disease in the early 1970s, after twice defying extinction, will charge the work of the tumors with a terrible, unbearable pathos. These lumpen confrontations with biology run amok, made from rubbish, newspapers, imprinted photographs, and cloth bunched into clumsy clumps by polyester resin. Are they exorcisms externalizing the invisible autogenetic killer within? And what happens when, as in some cases, these tumor forms are personalized, with photographic faces embedded, or indeed given molds from the artist's own features? Are they being claimed back by the subject whose body, and hence whose locus of subjective singularity they were destroying? Is this the secondary, belated moment of an earlier trauma, whose horror the sculptor had dedicated creative life of form-making to obliterate? And how do these clumsy objects register or dispel the repeated battle with mortality? Or register and dispel something else, accumulating, repeating trauma in the face of death? And why does she return to the luminous pallor of traditional marble for heads distorted yet strangely beautiful in malleable materials that were created by work with chemical modernity? This leads me to pose the question of what is the face for Alina Szapocznikow? Why was it so important? One of her earliest sculptures is a sculpted head, made when she was studying under the Czech sculptor Josef Wagner's mentorship in her sculpture studies in Prague, of which we have these photographic records. We see here her making a decision to be a sculptor, which is to make forms, to fabricate a mirroring other through this will to form. She shows us a head that asserts its integrity, completeness, and upright human dignity. Working creatively with socialist realist aesthetics that would dominate communist Poland until 1954, Szapocznikow then moves towards abstraction, using malleable cement to create a second kind of head, a molding, a Fautrier-like head object with features smeared but still poignant. By the 1960s, the use of casting and industrial materials take us beyond the tired oppositions of abstraction and figuration into new conjunctions that are both effacing and facializing, as here with her delicate 1966 self-portrait. By the early 1970s, casting from her body produces the face as trace, crushed, fragmented, sutured, broken, and although hung vertically, it is in fact a horizontal work that can only lie emptied on the ground. Here in its poignant polyester resin cast of her own face and body parts, it offers a serene opposition to the dark vision that we see here, where she uses the casts of her own lower face to contain the rubbish of carcinogenic cigarettes in one version of the Grass Widow's ashtray. And finally, in Souvenir 1, which I will come back to later, a photographic face of the artist as child is embedded in a desiccated, curling resin skin, linking moments of a traumatized past via the haunting mediation of two radically different photographs, two different moments before and after the rupture that is Auschwitz. The second series of what was shown in 1973 in Paris was the Herbarium, a group of works in low relief made from flattening polyester positive casts taken from negative plaster body casts of the artist and her adult son Piotr. You've already seen an example in the self-portrait I just showed you. These crushed and hence distorted body forms were hung pathetically on black wooden boards, functioning as both objects and relief sculptures, like modern industrialized versions of Andrea or Girolamo della Robbia. In fact, Alina Szapocznikow copied this one by Girolamo della Robbia in 1950 in Paris when she was training with a stonemason. Colorless, these seemingly soft polyester sculptures also remind me of flayed skin, like the famous image of Saint Bartholomew in Michelangelo's Last Judgment in the Vatican, which, as you can see on the left, also includes the projection of Michelangelo's own features onto the hanging skin. Yet, as such, they might tip into the abject, yet by being cast in this whiteness, their waxy whiteness also invokes the distancing and eternal peacefulness of carved marble. Sleep rather than death is suggested. Tender and pathetic in terms of affect, the meditative herbarium works counter the awkward litter of the clumsy forms of the tumors which lie scattered on the horizontal axis on beds of naked earth or scattered stone, suggesting both burial and disinterral. Both series insist on the organic physicality of the body, its own generative distortions, its fragility, and even its disappearance, leaving only an imprinted trace that signifies the remains of both a perishable body and of sculpture's former attempts to eternalize the body. Both the body represented and its imprint have suffered, and the procedure of body casting and then making an imprint in a malleable form, however, undoes the bonding of death and resurrection that marble once offered in the Western tradition of sculpture, as a means of maintaining the body beautiful in a petrified eternity that began with pagan antiquity and was then appropriated by the Christian resurrectionist imaginary for European culture. Even the full body cast that rests on the wall between the herbarium pieces in this show suggests, what does it suggest? It alters the classic axis of life on the vertical and death on the horizontal, neither supported by the ground nor, as it were, like a crucifixion hanging on a supportive stick. The sculpture is illegible in its ambiguity. The face suggests sleep, but the eyes are actually open but unsighted. And I was asking people how you can actually cast an open eye, which I don't think you can, so these must be formed subsequently. And this is not the slackness of death, but the body in its utterly vulnerable state without support. It might just balance in a permanent in-between state. Of the works in this 1973 show, Pierre Restanis, the longtime supporter of Szapocznikows' work in France, stated, "The tumours in the herbarium are Alina's," note the use of the first name. Everybody who can't speak Polish is always slipping to Alina. I lectured on her in India, and they just didn't get Szapocznikow, but you can practice if you just get a few. Szapocznikow. Think of it as S-H, Shah, and then Posh, and then Nikov, and you'll be so fluent. Anyway, Alina's last works, but apart from their naked value as a human testimony, they illustrate in a gripping way the naked truth of the creative process, conditioned directly by the imperious drives of organic sensuality. Alina had no need to conceptualize her love of life. I should do this with a French accent. She lived that love most intensely, with all her biology, that sensitive energy which became naturally crystallized in the act of creation. She had that rare gift, typical of great sculptors, the innate gift of integrating mental motivation into the flesh of forms, the idea into matter. Perspicacious and generous, Restanis' comments also betrayed the gendered and gendering tropes about Alina as spontaneous and sensual and carnal, while at the same time recognizing something profound that he cannot quite articulate in the intensity of what he calls her love of life. He is struggling to reconcile a quality that defies conceptualization and calculation, and yet invests matter with meaning, or sense, holding both the notion of sensuousness and the elusive suggestion of something more symbolic. I want to catch the difficulty of understanding a mental motivation that is translated into the flesh of forms when what we see are resin skins, entombing rubbish, and the empty trace of an invisible and fragmented body. Restanis will also write, sorry, that I think we've said that. Yes, Alina loved life completely, without mental reservation. She loved it with her mind and with her heart and with the sensual fullness of her body. During the Second World War at 13, she was deported, and that early experience of suffering and death marked her for life, but she emerged from it alive and beautiful, yet with no illusions. Her work was to be but one long scream of revolt against the genocide of the flesh and the ineluctable calamity of evil. It was to be a testimony and a premonition. The memory of the camp was to be replaced by a baleful premonition of a cancer that would claim her at the age of 45. In Restanis', therefore, dramatic text, we have three vital clues to understanding Alina Szapocznikows' artistic project. He interprets her work as both mute and deafening. It is a silent scream, wordless, inarticulate, but viscerally intense, and a testimony, bearing witness through some form of articulation or representation to an ethical and political revolt against what fascism had done and what she had been forced to see. Invoking the genocide of the flesh, Restani evokes the horror and pain burned into the flesh of those who were frozen, starved, and abjected by filth and disease. But this bare life of the human body, suspended between living and dying, has been formulated in the case of Alina Szapocznikow by means of art, encountering, enduring, surviving, and witnessing, but also seeking to forget, have been given an aesthetic form. And the term aesthetic here indicates not the harmonious beauty of the pre-Auschwitz Kantian system, but an ethical beauty of appropriately grave effects. Thus, Restani presents Szapocznikows work as a repetition that invokes trauma. Trauma is not merely a horrible thing that happened, but rather the unthinkable and the unknowable. Yet it seems that it can be aesthetically evoked through an artistic practice which could, by means of its deformations and novel materials, bear witness, if mutely, to a past of horror that was being silently mouthed. You will find the eye and the mouth, again, are features that recur all the way through the exhibition. Closed, except in the cases of two sculptures which literally seem to be screaming. Hence, the silent scream registers the will to expunge the pain from the body, while the body fails to provide the sounding board for the discharge of pain. Thus, Restani recognizes a potent force in the plastic work of Alina Szapocznikows' sculpture that finds a visual form for both, as it were, the unheard sound of the screaming body and the traumatically arrested silence in the face of the unspeakable, that for which, according to Lyotard, we have yet no adequate way of phrasing. So the life and work of Alina Szapocznikow stages the collision between the kinds of encounter with death that is not at all abstracted from sensuous embodied subjectivity. And that is why aesthesis, a form of knowing and an economy of affects that holds the sensuous, the sentient, and the reflective together without the division between mind and body, reason and flesh, does not become a site of consoling beautification. I would suggest to you that the experience of meeting the works of Alina Szapocznikow is that she created an aesthetic means to encounter the traumatic residues of real and sometimes awful histories. As a Jewish European woman, she endured a teenage girl's premature exposure to the concentration universe. She was forced to carry in her memory a terrible knowledge of relentless physical suffering and human degradation, and dying that she witnessed in a world cut off from the everyday, where no one else was present to witness what she'd seen. She had survived by working beside her mother, who also survived with her in the hospital. And I want to end this little section with the final state from Restani, who takes it to a new level when he says, all humanist discourse, all the cosmic vision of the artist is written in the carnal memory of the body. In the same way that her woman's body was, so each human body is the receptacle of life's experience. All Alina's work is dominated by this biological sense of history. Anatomy is the organic foundation of her language, and with the same organic gestures, the flesh of her sculptures registers the passage of time and the determination of its destiny. Now, across Alina Szapocznikows' extraordinary sculptural project, amplified by an equally extraordinary body of drawings, I want to trace a double movement that I call the register of trauma. Dramatically made visible in the installation of the exhibition at the Wiel Center in Brussels, where this show was originated, which was on 2 floors, we can see very clearly that there is a formal shift. I'm being very Rosalind Kraussian here, formal shift from the vertical axis, which you can see in the first room, and you can see in this installation the dark room in which they put the electrically wired pieces, to the second floor, which was a purely horizontal axis. Now, what do we make of this? In 1945, emerging from her concentration experience, Szapocznikow chooses to be a sculptor. In German, this is a Bildhauer, that means a hewer of images. And by following Czech modernism, she can effect a reconsolidation of the body through the embrace of traditional sculptural figuration shaped by modernist overtones. And this possibility found confirmation in the imposed hegemony of socialist realism, which offered cultural as well as economic support for artists working in post-war Polish communist reconstruction by means of making solid sculptural bodies. But the progressive dissolution of form, begun here with the move to abstraction, continues into the early 60s with a strange anxiety around holding forms together, some medical in their binding, others hilarious and joyfully erotic, others unbearably burdened, as you can see, by ontological memory and historical trauma, as the once upright sculptures slip to the horizontal, spill, flow, crumple, and corrupt. Anyone visiting the show will feel the force of this formal shift from the vertical to the horizontal, from work that is formulated, carved, cast, and placed in space, to other forms that seem to disintegrate and be about desiccation and decay. The carnality and often erotic humor seem on the side of life and joy, concerning procreative and the generative pleasures of the breast, and also the penis. On the other hand, the visitor has to encompass encounters with dismal materials laid on the ground, fragments, the oozing blackness of polyurethane foam with embedded body parts tending to the side of death. Does this combination link Szapocznikow with an ultimately surreal poetics, a pre-war imaginary, or does it indicate something worse? Is this the victory of the informe or the formless and the abject as it meets the concentration universe? In plotting this out, it is possible to argue that this body of work progressively registers the pressure of encrypted trauma deeply embedded in the body that does not achieve transformation but gives way before that pressure. Art does not become a transport station of trauma. Instead, its death-defying forms, at first erect and upright in the classical manner of sculpture, slowly succumb to the pull of the horizontal, hanging off walls, and finally to the dissolution of form. They said that despite the lively resistance of Szapocznikows erotics, encrypted trauma ultimately surfaces in forms and materials that shockingly imprinted via photographic layers, embedded into dried resin, the memories of the body through the fabrication of an artificial and damaged skin that directly produced the silent scream that is of both emblematic and real death. Now, I discovered the work of Alina Szapocznikow when I first went to Warsaw in 2003 to speak at a conference marking an exhibition of Louise Bourgeois, The Geometry of Desire. The conjunction was a pure coincidence, but clearly the relations between the two artists are tantalizing, and I, for a long while, imagined they'd actually met in Carrara, but unfortunately, they were there carving marble in 66 and 68, in the case of Louise Bourgeois, and 67, Szapocznikow, so they were never there together. In 2003, I was given the catalogue of the only book in English on the artist from the exhibition organized by Ander Rottenberg in 1998 at the Schenta Gallery in Warsaw to mark the 25th anniversary of an artist still renowned in Poland and also who had been internationally renowned in her lifetime, but had become lost to view by becoming just one of the old canon of an earlier era. Rottenberg commented on the lack of response to the 1973 exhibition shortly after the artist's death, and she wrote, "The exhibition fell on stony ground. The autotelic and linguistic references within the sphere of 70s artists," I think she's referring to conceptualism, "did not accord with the carnality and drama of the artist's work. A new generation had to grow up before art started to deal with the human body. Louise Bourgeois gained recognition only a few years ago. Eva Hesse, who'd been active more or less at the same time as Alina, did not leave her imprint on American art until the 1990s. Alina Szapocznikow is still waiting for her place, which is her due." Thus, despite the fascination with her personal fate and functioning of our bodies, Rottenberg felt Szapocznikow was still awaiting her time 10 years after the realignment of Eastern and Western Europe, and our expanded understanding of art in the later 20th century across all of that continent. Is this now her moment? Now, the cover of, as we can see here, I just put down a little bit of the history of the reception. Somebody was asking this before, but we can see how a number of exhibitions have had to take place in museums or dealers' work. Anke Kempnes and Gisela Kapitein have played a very good, important role. Alina Szapocznikow was featured in Documenta in 2007. This led to two exhibitions, one in Germany, in Cologne, and one in New York. And when Roberta Smith saw the Alina Szapocznikow and said, "This is okay, this is good," the New Yorkers embraced her, and ultimately we'll have a chance to see the full exhibition in due course. Now, the cover of Rottenberg's catalogue sported the 1966 self-portrait, which when you see it on the cover looks monumental and imposing. In fact, it is small and delicate, carved in marble with several discs of polyester resin standing for a head and a face made with just the cast of the lips. Now, when I saw this particular work, my thoughts flew in so many different directions. Why had I only, in the life of a dedicated feminist art historian, only now come across an artist like this? How could she have made her work behind the Iron Curtain, as I then thought, which had so many resonances with the work of so many artists of her period? Was she a long-lost sister to Louise Bourgeois, to Eva Hesse, also dangerously experimenting with industrial materials? Was she closer to Linda Benglis, who was pouring resin, polyester resins? And it's interesting to note that in 2007, there was an exhibition that joined Benglis and Bourgeois together by Hyman Reed in New York. But by 2009, Benglis, Bourgeois, and Alina Szapocznikow, under the title After Awkward Objects, was installed at Hauser and Wirth in London. Now, what happens if we link Alina Szapocznikow with American pop art or international proto-feminist art of the 70s? She has been placed beside the Venezuelan pop artist Marisol Escobar, not only in a French journal in 1969, but in a recent show about women in pop art in the US. She was clearly on the edges of Parisian Nouvelle Realistes, especially close to Cesare Baldanicini, whom she met in Paris in 1948. And he, as you can see, relations with his work, he also does body casts. And she was very irritated that he got his giant thumb as a cast in, although he made it after she had made her first body casts. He's also going to be using expanded polystyrene and flowing materials. She therefore knew also Jeanne Tinguely, whose work with machines links up with obviously Goldfinger. She knew Eva Eppley, his first wife, the Swiss artist, working with various kinds of images and bodies, and also his second wife, Niki de Saint-Phal, really powering herself to significance with her shooting paintings and also her created body sculptures. She was also close with the very young Christian Boltanski and with Annette Messager, on whose work one can see her influence. And we mustn't forget that there is still a world beyond in Eastern Europe to be talked up, because she was studied with Vera Januszkova, but here also with Kmentova Eva, or Eva Kmentova, we would say in Western Europe, as they say it there. And you can see, again, there's a whole rich world of sculptural practice experimentally happening in the same generation. And here is Vera Januszkova, who's also working between the machine and abstraction and figuration and new materials. Just give you some sense of this sequencing. Here is Szapocznikow. Here, of course, is Louise Bourgeois. Their Carrara experiences there. Now, Eva Hesse is obviously a reference point. Okay. Now, I want to go back a moment to 2007. I hope you're keeping up with my jumping around. I'm sorry not to be chronological. But in 2007, a very much larger part of the art world encountered Alina Szapocznikow because she was selected for Documenta 12 by Ruth Nowak. The self-portrait was also exhibited, but what was remembered and noted by many international visitors were the posthumous photo sculptures also shown here. Photographs of masticated chewing gum, they were made in 1971, but were only shown in this form as photographic piece in 1978, after her death. Strange and disturbing forms at once holding a shape and seeming on the verge of morphing into something as yet undisclosed, the material and the scale of the works was hard to grasp. They seemed quite substantial as sculptures made in some malleable substance set against or hanging off hard stone or wood. Mounted in white frames, the sequence of photographs of sculptural forms were at once two-dimensional and serial, refined, contained, and optical. Discovering that the museum was actually chewing gum, and the formative agent, the teeth and the tongue of the mouth, introduced into the aesthetic of minimalist order and visual distanciation and almost abject physicality. Chewed gum, like shed hair, nail clippings, scabs, or blood separated from the body, breached the boundaries of the clean, contained body, painfully reminding us of our fluids and discharges, our cycles of renewal and desiccation. The inside of the mouth, like our genital cavities, are moist and sensitive, but culturally invisible. We like our art dry and removed from these troubling borderlines between the inside and the outside, the clean and the dirty, the sacred and the impure. Our two greatest taboos concern blood and death, followed by things that flow from our bodies, such as sweat or urine. Tears we seem able to handle, and in her great piece at Documenta 9, 1991, Louise Bourgeois created beautiful but empty glass vials to hold all the excretions of the body, some concerned with fear, other with passion, most with the ordinary facts of corporeal existence: snot, tears, shit. Now, it struck me as fascinating that it was the photo sculptures by Alina Szapocznikow that, when shown by Anke Kempness in her gallery in New York, attracted both New York critics and museum creators, setting in motion the move that will at last, as I say, allow Szapocznikow to find her place in the narratives of 20th century art, crowned by an exhibition arriving later on this year in the Museum of Modern Art in New York. It might be easy to make a case for these photo sculptures, despite, in a sense, not being exhibited in the artist's lifetime. But by entering them not into the Museum of Modern Art, but what I call the virtual feminist museum, where all those artists who haven't been curated by the Museum of the Modern Art happily find themselves in a happy conversation and relationship. Thus, we would have to place them beside the work of Hannah Wilkie, who has also had to wait decades since her untimely death, also from cancer, to be recognized as one of the major sculptural presences of the 20th century Euro-American art. In 1974, the year after Szapocznikows death, Wilke independently began masticating chewing gum. She softened and shaped the often colored gum into beautiful vulval forms, which she sometimes attached to her own body or to found images. Audiences were invited to participate during performances and attach these shaped works to walls and texts. It has been suggested that marking her own body with the insignia of her female sex touched both on the abjected aspects of female sexuality, but also introduced a scarifying that has darker historical resonances. Both aspects resonated in specific and historical as well as ethnic ways for Hannah Wilkie, who in an interview remarked, "My consciousness comes from being a Jew during World War II." Remembered like Szapocznikow for her striking physical beauty, which she freely used in daring and intensely corporeal sculptural work, in live performance and photo sculpture, Wilkie's sense of Jewish identification and her work's reference to historical trauma inflicted on the Jewish body is not usually part of the typical discourse on her work. It is also a terrible irony that Wilkie would also die young, documenting the mortal progress of her own cancer in a series of what I would like to name, following Nancy Princetal's new book on her, photo sculptures. Her final work, Intravenous 1994, is also posthumous, printed and assembled photographic staged series of staged photographs, painfully presenting a tender work she'd undertaken with her own mother as she had struggled many years before with breast cancer. This links us with the body so anguished in the photograph of the post-operative Szapocznikow, whose drawings of her own surgical ordeal were in the exhibition in Wielsen and probably in the catalogue, including one which confronts her crudely sutured wound where her amputated breast had once been. So I've introduced this conversation here because both artists created works whose engagement with the body was not just that. It was not the body, but my body, a female body, a Jewish woman's body, a body at the core of a horrific crime that disturbs the attempts we make to encounter artwork in the clean, whitened, neutralized frame that has made the photo sculptures the object of excited adulation. As we encounter the exhibition like this in all its complexity and diversity, we will be shocked, delighted, frightened, repulsed, amazed at the range of works from finely carved figuration to molded abstraction, from machinic assemblage to electrified sex. What is happening here? What do we need to bring to our imaginative frames to see Alina Szapocznikows' work as her own singular signature on the burnt pages of a terrible history, as well as on the newly written surfaces of post-war hope? So let me briefly come back to the face. You will see in this exhibition this 1948, or any time between 48 and 56, self-portrait. It's not remarkable. Drawn in order to capture her large dark eyes, her curly dark hair, her full lips, we are looking at what would have visibly been read in Europe in the middle of the 20th century as not a Polish face, but a Jewish look. The making of this image set beside her passport photograph, which also traps one into signs that people carry of what kind of identity goes with what kinds of looks. This would mark her visible alterity in a still anti-Semitic Europe. And this reminds me of Adrian Piper's brilliant work, where she creates a self-portrait called Self-Portrait Exaggerating My Negroid Features, besides Self-Portrait as a Nice White Lady, trying to play on the fantasies, the racist fantasies, which project themselves onto people's looks. Now let me jump quickly then to Souvenir once again, Souvenir 1 dated 1971, which I showed you earlier in the sequence on the face and self-prevail. This is made from polyester, glass wool and photography, and into the polyester have been fixed enlargements of 2 photographs. Now, first of all, you need to see a black and white photograph to see that we've lost the images. I'm going to use my pointer. Wonderful. Okay, here and here, there's been discoloration. So in the photograph from the period, you can see that the face that is here is also repeated 3 times. She's looking at her there, and she's looking upwards from there. So she's caught in this triple gaze. Now, the way she made it is this. So here is the photograph from her childhood, where she sits on the shoulders of her father, who died in 1939. Here is the found image, which has then been altered in its axis. Okay. And here is the montage in the archive, the photo montage from which this work is the work will then be made by printing that into resin, and then adding the tumor-like excrescences. And it was also, you can see from this side image, the way in which it here it curls out. It curls out from the wall. Now, it's a holiday snap of a young girl in a bathing costume, transformed into a kind of death's head by the roughness of the translation of this cheap 1930s photograph into this new form. The father who has died is cut out. The innocence of childhood is translated into and encounters the atrocity of death and the mortality of cancer. Now, I want to link this particular quality of dried skin to the horrific images of the exhibition that was taking place in 1945 in Buchenwald of the removal of tattooed skin from certain prisoners by Ilse Koch, because she quite liked them, so she killed the prisoners, took their skin and made lampshades after them. But I want to set that again with someone else I mentioned earlier, Charlotte Delbo, which I hope will take us further into this question of how to read Souvenir. Delbo's skin was tattooed with the prisoner number, as is shown in this post-war photograph by Eric Schwab, of the recovered writer, making real the concept of history and trauma being written on the body or written in the flesh. In her attempt to explain something of the paradoxes of trauma that resist what she calls common memory and is indelible, constant, and inescapable, Charlotte Delbo's writings involve 2 dimensions of skin. First, she compared leaving the camp behind to a snake shedding its old skin. Explaining the inexplicable, there comes to mind the image of a snake shedding its old skin, emerging from beneath it in a fresh, glistening one. In Auschwitz, I took leave of my skin. It had a bad smell, that skin, worn from all the blows it had received, and I found myself in another, beautiful and clean, although with me the molting was not as rapid as the snake's. Along with the old skin went the visible traces of Auschwitz, the leaden stare out of sunken eyes. The tottering gait, the frightened gestures. In this first metaphorical evocation of skin, Delbo writes of the liberated survivor shedding her dirtied, abjected, tortured camp non-self, like a snake shedding its skin. The new Charlotte is clean, boundaried, warm, fed, apparently returned and normalized. She uses a knife and fork, goes to the toilet, bathes, sometimes even smiles with her eyes. In a counter-image, however, Delbo suggests that the traumatic real of the camp cannot be shed. It is merely buried or blocked off by a toughened membrane that attempts to cover over the abyss of endlessly vivid traumatic sensations. Rid of its old skin, it's still the same old snake. I am the same too, apparently. However, how does one rid oneself of something buried far within? Memory and the skin of memory, it clings to me yet. Memory's skin has hardened, it allows nothing to filter out of what it retains, and I have no control over it. I don't feel it anymore. The skin over this abyss is sometimes breached, the membrane that divides the present from the other time and place whose sensations defy words and their power to structure a journey away from unbearable experiences, disintegrates. Delbo affirms that at any moment she can suddenly feel and be completely plunged in the total sensorium of an arrested and ever-powerful time and place that interpenetrates with her current moment and refuses the very concept of a past. The memory is in the skin, or in the muscles, as Rousset said. It is both reality and metaphor. She changes again. Not quite yet, I've got another quote. The skin's enfolding the memory of Auschwitz is tough. Even so, it gives way, at times revealing all it contains. And then she produces the concept of deep memory. Deep memory preserves sensations, physical imprints. It is the memory of the senses, for it isn't words that are swollen with emotional charge. She compares the word thirst shared between those who have known Auschwitz thirst and the everyday feeling that makes one feel like having a cup of tea or a glass of juice. In dreams, she says, I physically feel that real thirst, and it is an atrocious nightmare. Enveloped in its own skin, memory for Delbo lives beneath a hard layer that isolates the ever-intense, traumatizing event, but maintains it so that the self is experienced as living beside this other, ever-present event that happened to a self that has been alienated by means of this internal boundary, a boundary that is at once a scar tissue of traumatic events, written literally but psychically etched on the body. Yet this membrane cannot be trusted to maintain the boundary between the encrypted, sensorially imprinted trauma and the living subject. It is significant that the book from which I've just been quoting was, however, the last collection of poems and sketches that Delbo assembled. And she writes, Auschwitz is so deeply etched on my memory that I cannot forget one moment of it. So you're living next to Auschwitz? Living with it? No, I live next to it. Auschwitz is there unalterable, precise but enveloped in the skin of memory, an impermeable skin that isolates it from my present self. Unlike the snake skin, the skin of memory does not renew itself. Oh, it may harden further. Alas, I fear lest it grow thin and crack, and the camp get hold of me again. Thinking about that makes me tremble with apprehension. In this underlying memory, sensations remain intact, no doubt. I am very fortunate in not recognizing myself in the self that was in Auschwitz. To return from there was so improbable that it seems to me I was never there at all. No, it's all too incredible. And everything that happened to that other, that Auschwitz one, now has no bearing on me, does not concern me. So separate from one another are these deep-lying memory and the ordinary memory. I live within a twofold being. The Auschwitz double does not bother me, does not interfere with my life, as though it weren't I at all. But without this split, I wouldn't have been able to survive. And then the quotes that I've just given you before. Now, it's in this context that I briefly want to move towards my conclusion. I'm going to steal an extra 5 minutes if I can bear with you. If you have to rush off to Super Bowl, go now. But I want to come back to that. In the light of having listened to that, how do we now look at this work? And if I look at this work in relation to Eva Hesse, I am draw a new comparison, because Eva Hesse's work was made, as you can see on the right-hand side, this is a test piece for Contingent, which was kept free from light and dark and reveals something of the fleshiness and the rubberiness that was the original work. But this is its state now, dried and desiccated. And people have asked, should they recreate Eva Hesse's works using the materials to give us back the visceral, icky fleshiness of her work? And I've worked with a fabricator to see what the effect of dipping rope, like the rope piece, in this kind of, in the particular material she dipped it into, and it really does turn your stomach with a sense of looking at guts drawing out of a kind of erupted abdomen. But my understanding is that she knew these works would not last. And unlike Szapocznikow, who used chemistry to preserve her works, Eva Hesse allowed the works to die because she wanted to create an artwork that could not become a possible life after death, could not convey resurrection, that would itself remind us of the intractability of death. And this leads me to my final little art historical point, which I will go through very quickly. It's written more up in the book, but I feel it's so important to bring this round. This is a work by Hans Holbein from the 16th century, from 1521, which is a most extraordinary rendering of the Christian theme, a very rare theme of Christ's entombment. It's the body of the dead Christ in the tomb. It can be seen in the museum in Basel. You can see how relentless it is in its horizontality, the oppressiveness of the narrow space allocated to the elongated corpse. The pressure of the painting shape enforces the burden of the slab that rests upon the body of the coffin, entombing the cold, yellowing, and tortured body. Now, according to Hegel, Christian thought, theology, and hence iconography circles around the paradox of a natural death, the death of the body, and its overcoming through one death, a sacrifice made out of such divine love that death itself is overcome for once and for all. Thus, this is a painting that captures a unique moment before the resurrection of the body in what is usually experienced by the Christian subject or thinker as a sequence of suffering, deposition, and resurrection. In artistic representations, bystanders who register the appropriate grief or astonishment, doubt, and joy attend these three moments. The body is subjected to passages more often than not represented as the body of pathos in these beautiful drawings by Michelangelo, but in the Gothic tradition, we can see in the Grunewald Eisenheim altarpiece closed, you can see the entombment moment below, but you have to imagine before this gruesome crucifixion, which is countered by this absolutely glorious resurrection. Now, in her 1982 study of melancholia, of depression, Black Sun, Julia Kristeva devotes a whole chapter to Holbein's dismal painting. Her study is an attempt to explore the historical moment, which is the moment of Protestantism, when a different image or meaning of the death of the Christ figure was articulated in Christian Europe, which did not have the glorious grandeur of the Italian tradition, which you've seen in Michelangelo's other, but was going to transform our way of understanding what it is that it means for the Protestant imagination to have taken over. So she writes, with no intermediary, suggestion, or indoctrination, whether pictorial or theological, other than our ability to imagine death, we are led to collapse in the horror of the caesura constituted by death, or to dream of an invisible beyond. Does Holbein forsake us as Christ for an instant had imagined himself forsaken? Or does he, on the contrary, invite us to change the Christly tomb into a living tomb, to participate in painted death and thus include it in our life, in order to live with it and make it live? For the living body, in opposition to the rigid corpse, is a dancing body. Does not our life, through identification with death, become the danse macabre, in keeping with Holbein's well-known depiction? But then she goes on to show that the Protestant melancholic vision that Holbein's moment presents a problem for painters. From the painterly point of view, we are facing a major test. The problem is to give form and color to the non-representable, conceived not as erotic luxuriance as it appears in Italian art and even in the representation of Christ's Passion. Rather, it's the non-representable conceived as the dissipation of the means of representation on the thresh of their extinction in death. Now, Kristeva's work about the 16th century painter were written after the historic events of the 20th century that we should understand challenge both the Catholic and Protestant Christian imaginations that had dominated Western figurative art and its various painterly and iconographical resources for confronting human mortality with an image. Following Sartre and Adorno, writing post-Auschwitz philosophy, we comprehend that something real happened in the mass dying of men, women, and children, and in the manner and the to highlight the persecution of European Jewry. But when we move into work by survivors of the concentration camps, here the Slovenian artist Zoran Muzic, here drawings he made in Dachau in 1945, we are looking at the Holbeinian Christ, that particular form of the almost gothically expressionist and agonized image of death, except these are not dead men. And that is a new moment. This is something else. This is not just the vision of a corpse. These are human beings reduced to a state between life and death. But you can see how the Holbeinian is still being used. In Friedrich Fritter, the Czech artist, who was one of the great artists of Terezín, who was persecuted amongst for trying to produce images like this, to tell us we are again seeing that iconography, but not of the dead, who will be resurrected, but the not yet dead, the Mussulman. And we see even a Christological echo in a photograph taken by a journalist at the scenes of the liberation of the concentration camps. So this Christological imaginary is present, and these Musich and Fritter's works still draw on the Gothic modernist paroxysm of pain translated from Holbein's Protestant image into 20th century expressionism. As such, they can only repeat existing ways of imagining suffering rather than seeking creatively to produce new forms to meet the novelty of the circumstances of representation after Auschwitz. So, to come to my conclusion, I think I would like to draw your attention to one work going back into the moment that the exhibition begins, 1955, a work called Exhumed, because I'm not suggesting cause and effect in terms of the history and artwork of Alina Szapocznikow. I'm suggesting that some process is happening in the whole trajectory of her work, which touches at different moments on the attempt to turn away from the history she'd experienced, but ultimately finding that it was impossible. Now, this work is a political work that was made to honor, pay tribute to a Hungarian politician murdered in 1945, but rehabilitated during the Hungarian thaw of 1955. Originally exhibited at rehabilitation, the title now, Exhumed, moves away from the verbal rhetoric of rehabilitating a reputation to the drastic realism of representing an exhumed, hence decomposing body. This is not resurrection in the old Christian sense, but the uncovering of a buried past whose actual physical form must come somewhat horrifically to light. The torso is shown upright, as if the figure is sitting, but without arms or complete legs. The body is at once an amputated fragment and a figure of a rising defiance. It is blindfolded, and if you look closely, it doesn't show in this, it has an open mouth as if it is performing a silent scream. It could be compared, of course, to the work of Germaine Richier, of Henry Moore, also to the brutal, or the art brut of Volz and Fautrier and Dubuffet, as Czartoryska, the wonderful Polish writer on Alina Szapocznikow, calls it. She too compares it to the figures caught in a permanent state in the Vesuvial lava flow at Pompeii. But then she writes, if Exhumed is rightly perceived as an innovative work, one must take into account that it was made by a mature artist who was familiar with the decaying body, dug out of the mud and devoid of limbs. For Alina Szapocznikow, the history of figurative sculpture and its inspiration, the knowledge of the transitory nature of the human body, is found not only in museums, but also in junkyards of stones and discarded sculptural fragments, and terrible as it may sound, in the camp cattle trucks with layers of dead bodies. Perhaps this last above all. Thus understood, the history of the representation of the human figure of miserable human shapes is ambiguous and instructive, and obviously prefigured by the fate of sculptures destroyed by war and corroded by climate. But the final point I want to make in relation to Souvenir is, of course, that it was also mediated by images in the media, because the kinds of images that are bringing the memory of the camp to the surface are works made also, like in 1955, Nuit et Brouillard, and this was the photograph that I first thought was embedded in Souvenir until I identified it, but also in 1945, Władysław Strużminski, who was one of the great fathers of modernism and the founder of the Museum of Modern Art in Łódź, created this series of work called À mes amis juifs, to my Jewish friends, and one of the images you can see also rehearses something of this same attention to the horror of these images of those caught in a moment of inhuman death. So when we return to Souvenir, we see, as it were, the conjunction of the before and the after, the rupture that she has now imprinted into a single space of this residue of curling skin, this detachment from the body, no longer soft and marmorean like the ones in the herbarium pieces, but ones which are mediated by the photographic image, but bring this silent, screaming face against the once happy, innocent, smiling face of childhood. So in my final conclusion, I can't but see in this image a new form of death that was created in and by the media, fixed as cultural memory, even for those who had themselves witnessed such processes traumatically. The archive of Alina Szapocznikow offers a post-Christian encounter with a kind of inhuman death created by a racist deadliness from which we can derive no narratives of resurrection or redemption. Instead, it poses only the endless question of fidelity to inventing an aesthetic encounter with suffering, the ethics of perpetual witnessing, and the life politics of a determined resistance to the totalitarian terror that had threatened it. If Alina Szapocznikow is finally to have her moment, to be incorporated into the history of international 20th century art, let it not be for what is most easily assimilated, such as the photo sculptures, brilliant as they are. They are too neatly framed, too contained, too photographic, too tame. Let it not be for the resonance with surrealism or pop art or machine art, but let it be for the difficulty of our encounter with a project that struggled to recreate a human world after a catastrophe that radically ruptured human history, to recreate it at first using traditional formula for human idealization and dignity in the upright form of figurative sculpture, that found one which found itself ultimately undone by the surfacing of the past, the return of the repressed, the pressure of encrypted trauma escaping from its attempted entombment, that was ultimately encoded in sculptural forms that clung to the body. But then they became detached, tattooed with history and its rupture, but also bulging with the deadly autogenetic present of mortality from within. Alina Szapocznikows work is not tragic. I want to see it as heroic in the face of trauma that refused ultimate, that clung to the body. But then they became detached, tattooed with history and its rupture, but also bulging with the deadly autogenetic present of mortality from within. Alina Szapocznikows work is not tragic. I want to see it as heroic in the face of trauma that refused ultimately to be resisted. Her sculpture was indeed undone, but the journey is one of the most vivid projects seeking aesthetic transformation of trauma that finally could not hold back against the surfacing of an encounter that was shown here in splitting her from her childhood innocence. But another kind of dying would come to this new world, a mortality of the excessively lively flesh, namely cancer, which itself finally betrayed her. She lived and worked both too early for our deeper understanding of what she, like others, had survived, that only emerged into cultural recognition after the 1990s, and she died too soon and therefore was too late to share what I hope will now be the long-deserved recognition for this extraordinary sculptural project that is at once so profoundly personal, so dedicated to life, so catastrophically historical, and teaches us that we ultimately will all have to confront death. Thank you. I think I'm happy to take any questions if anybody has the energy or thought, but we can leave a little pause while those who have to go, and anybody who wants to reflect. I'm afraid my lectures tend to have a slightly heavy quality to them.
I wanted to know about her son. You know, he's alive and...
Is he here? He was around, but...
Oh.
He's been at the exhibition. So what did you want to know?
Did she ever marry?
Yes, she married twice. She was married, first of all, to one of the leading art historians in Poland, Ryszard Stanisławski, who became the director of the National Museum. And then she was married to Roman Śliszowicz, who was one of the most influential designers, who was also Polish, but they went back to live in France. And her son, Piotr, is Piotr Stanisławski. But he is very much alive and well, and obviously, having held the legacy of his mother in his dark basement while no one was interested, has finally had the support of all these different people to bring it to work. So I think it was been a very joyous occasion for him to be here and to see what he knew to be an extraordinary oeuvre finally take its place in the museums. But he has been in Los Angeles all this weekend.
I keep thinking of the poetry of Paul Celan, and I'm wondering if there's a comparable kind of argument, so to speak, between a kind of progression of how Celan's poetry started to dissolve linguistically over the course of his practice, and then also with, in a way, his use of German as a kind of contaminated material, and her use of industrial materials as also maybe similarly contaminated.
Thank you very much. That's a wonderful question. I think you, in a sense, you have already made the conjunctions very interestingly. I don't have any evidence for whether she knew Paul Celan or knew of his work, obviously, but he did work as a translator in Paris, so may well have been part of some kind of group that she encountered. But I think you've picked up on two elements. One is the necessity that those people, those artists who were working in this after Auschwitz model, the two elements of it, one is the initial desire to make something that, as a form that could hold. And so the will to become a poet or the will to become a sculptor is to create something that has a certain kind of formal integrity as some kind of container for things. Because writing and speaking, whether you're writing poetry or making a form, it introduces a certain syntax. And this, psychoanalysts make this point that it's the syntactical structuration of our experience that enables us to deliver a certain distance from the overwhelming proximity of that which we experience as affectively and traumatic that we can't digest. So there is the will towards that, and therefore I don't know the poetry of Celan well enough to make a comment about this dissolution, but it wouldn't surprise me if this question that I'm suggested of encrypted trauma, there's the will to sort of create new forms that would somehow get a distance from it, but nonetheless it leaks, it undoes from within, urging on some kind of recognition. But if you consistently try to get away from it, that recognition will take certainly symptomatic forms. And the symptomatic form is the difficulty of the breakdown of syntax. So that would seem to me to make some sense of what you're saying. And the other side that you're mentioning, which is this, which I started with, which is part of my other kind of research, which is I do not think we appreciate, because we have the model of Holocaust memory, which makes us say it happened then, it was a one-off, it was an appalling event, the genocide. But what we don't realize is what I'm trying to stress with the concentrationary. So let me just make a little distinction here. Jewish people and Romani and Sinti people were murdered in 4 camps, mostly in Poland, all of which was dissolved by 1943. Auschwitz is an exception because in 1942 they built Birkenau, and the people who were killed in Birkenau are Western Jews. So the mass of Eastern European Jews are killed in 4 camps that are then closed. Those are the death camps. Concentration camps are not death camps. There were 10,000 concentration camps all over Germany by 1945. They are systematically part of the totalitarian operation. They're outside every town, every village, every resort. They're on and on and on and on. You will find them, and their purpose was to destroy people who represented any form of deviation or any form of political resistance by destruction through dehumanizing, starvation, overwork, and torture. Now, 1.2 million people did die in concentration camps out of the whole period from 33 to 45. But the concentrationary is this experimental space which Hannah Arendt takes up for this systematic destruction of human beings. First, you remove people from any judicial status. You have no name, you have no number, no name, no identity, no civil status. Secondly, you're put in a situation where any gesture that you might make as a human being, such as sacrifice or giving up yourself, has no meaning. If you killed yourself, they would just kill 15 other people to punish for having killed yourself. So other people would die. So there's no moral gesture you can make in the concentration camp. And finally, you are reduced by starvation, by the absolute attrition of your body, to the point at which your body simply longs for food, will do anything to have water or anything to have food. Therefore, you become a bundle of reactions. You are no longer a human being with a decision, right? So that's a very different thing, because if you go to an extermination camp, you are dead within the hour. Vumph, gone, nothing, right? If you go to a concentration camp, people lived in concentration camps for 10 years. Some survived, some didn't. It got more and more extreme towards the end of the war, obviously. Primo Levi is a concentration camp survivor. Elie Wiesel is a concentration camp survivor. Jean Emery is a concentration camp survivor, because they were not selected for murder, they were selected for slave labor in Monowitz. So in that particular world, this question of industrial modernity and technology and political novelty is the thing that the survivors are trying to draw attention to, and that didn't end with the closing of Auschwitz. That is implicit in elements of modernity, and this is Zygmunt Bauman's argument about modernity in the Holocaust. The Holocaust wasn't caused by modernity, but it's the condition of it is modernity. It needs bureaucratization, transport systems, technology, pesticides, industrial chemistry, doctors, a whole apparatus to deliver this system. And some aspects, therefore, of modern production, or any part of our system whose only logic is what can be got from people, that is a concentrationary logic. And in that sense, I think we've not been hearing in survivors' representations the question put to industrial modernity. And in even Jacques Lacan, writing in his psychoanalysis, talks about the new concentrationary social bond, which is the nature of modern existence. He's writing that in 1949. So I think when we talk about this sense of the contaminated industrial, or the contaminated modern, or German as a contaminated language, there is a sense in what I'm calling concentrationary memory, that those who are wanting to call out to us to say, listen, don't just think you can mourn the dead. You must remember this has happened. This could happen. This is the reality. And it's in a form that isn't inside camps. The camp is the laboratory for it, but it is spreading. It can reappear in certain kinds of ways in our cultures of violence, in our toleration of movies whose whole purpose is to expose us to atrocious acts against the fragility or perishability of the human body. So I pick up on that sense of not just the sort of thing. And finally, of course, the question of German, because I think in that little film, it's very difficult, and it was so difficult because Germany was so rapidly incorporated into Western, European, Euro-American sort of NATO axis, for the problem of German and Germany for the survivors. It's there in Primo Levi's work. He dedicates it to German readers, right? And I think that in some sense, Alina Szapocznikow is just saying, 1955 or 63, you can't say certain things anymore. But Celan, I think, did it via language. So I think that's where he's slightly different, because he could play in the actual, Kafkaesque element of the language, German language.
Oh, well, thank you so very much for your lecture. It was a tour de force. I really learned so much listening to you. And I actually, I'm going to say her name right. I didn't know Szapocznikow was Jewish. I didn't know anything about her at all. And I came to hear you talk about her, though. And so I'm curious from her biography, why did she stay? I mean, I'm not quite clear on exactly where she lived after. Okay. But I was curious, in a way, why she did stay, if she stayed in Poland or why she stayed in Europe. Because she's a very rare individual in having survived at all, being a Polish Jew. And so among those who did survive, most didn't stay, I don't believe, or some who did try to go back home were then murdered, in 1946. So just curious about that. And also, in terms of her own view of her work, I think you touched upon it somewhat, how did she view her work in relationship to her experience in a concentration camp or in the concentrationary world that she survived into.
Thank you very much. I'm glad you brought this up because obviously these little facts and details. In 1945, when she was, we think, in Terezin or Theresienstadt, she did not go back to Poland. She changed the spelling of her name and pretended that she'd been born on the Czech side of the border and so went to Prague. So she didn't go back to Poland. Nobody would have thought about it. She then went to Paris 3 or 4 years later, where there was a large Polish expatriate community. So she had no reason. She'd left school at 13, so I don't think she spoke French, but she went and lived in this expatriate community in Paris. But she was finally forced to leave because the French authorities began to realize that she had lied about her national identity, and so she was effectively deported because she had incorrect papers. And the only place she could be deported to was the place of her birth. But by the time she went back to Poland, it wasn't the Poland of the pre-war, because it was now Poland undergoing its own communist revolution. And there are some very interesting texts, one by Janina Bauman, who wrote a story of her own experience in the Warsaw Ghetto, but wrote a second volume called Dream of Belonging, which is the story of why she and various other survivors, Polish Jewish survivors, chose to be part of the rebuilding of a socialist Poland. And in the early years, you could be a Zionist and go off, just leave Europe and go to newly found Israel, or you became part of this utopian dream that you were going to create the post-fascist utopia. But very rapidly, of course, it becomes clear that this is a Stalinist communism that is going to betray the very deep ambitions and beliefs of the young people who are engaged with this communist rebuilding. So her book, Dream of Belonging, is a wonderful book about that disillusionment of those who were involved. So being a communist in Poland and building communist Poland was good, but it was destroyed by the discovery of what Stalin was really like. And secondly, under the new regime, there was a way in which you could be an artist, because communist societies use artists. Unlike capitalist societies where you have to sink or swim, they actually had formal processes, and they needed people to be part and parcel of the whole ideological revolution. So you could do she was given a sculptural studio, she was given money, she was able to participate in competitions to build monuments to Polish-Soviet friendship, to monuments to Auschwitz, which was understood as a Polish suffering. She even did a great, huge sculpture of Stalin. Okay, so in that particular period. And she remains because in the late 40s, she discovered her mother was still alive. And so she also lives in Poland with her Polish husband, Stanislavski, and her mother. And only in 61, when her mother dies, does she begin to think about leaving and going to France, because she represents Poland in the Venice Biennale in 62, I think it is. So she's beginning to have international recognition. So she also leaves Stanislavski, and Roman Sislovich gets a job on Vogue Paris. So she goes to live in Paris and lives in Malakoff, which is the artistic community where Tinguely and Guy de Saint-Phal and the Nouvelle Réaliste. So that's why she goes back to Paris, but she still moves between a studio in Paris and Warsaw in the 60s. And she's actually in Warsaw in 1968, when on the one hand, you're going to have the student revolution in Paris that she comes back to, but also the anti-Jewish pogrom, the anti-Semitic pogroms under Gromulko's regime, which led a whole new set of Polish Jewish intellectuals who had stayed and been part of the new system, were forced to escape. So she escapes again, goes to Paris, and that's why then she says no more Poland after that. So that's that bit of the particular history. The second bit, what does she say? We have lots of photographs, and then you've got the documentary upstairs, the two documentaries, one by Roman Polanski for television, and then the Jean-Martin Drault one that's upstairs. And she doesn't say at all very much. She says, I won't speak about in public. It's not proper to speak about. I've spoken about in private. But in that film, she does mention very briefly, I noticed when I was watching it again, this question. She seems to agree that something is shifting in her sculpture. And she says, maybe it is the memories surfacing. Maybe it is the childhood. Maybe it is the memories. She says to one of her husbands, I can't remember which one, that there is a gulf so great between us that we will never know what each other has experienced. So we have these little moments in what we have of her writings where she indicates, and that's what I'm building on, this sense of what her experience is. But the whole point of it is, post-war, most people didn't want to know what those experiences were. They are, I mean, even if I make you listen to them, you think, who is this woman coming in, casting this pall of horror over my nice sunny Los Angeles Sunday afternoon by making me think about what this is. We don't want to know this, on one hand. Certainly post-war, people didn't know, and as Primo Levi says, he had this terrible dream that he would come back and say, I've got to tell you what happened, and they'll say, now get over it, Primo, you've finished with it, go on now, start a new life, okay? We don't want to know, and that came true. People didn't listen. He couldn't get his work, I mean, he wrote his work in the late 40s. It wasn't published till 58, properly. You know, Elie Wiesel's book Night wasn't published in French until the late 50s. There's a very slow process by which the world has been able to come to terms that this event wasn't just something that happened to a bunch of people that, you know, if you're not one of them, who cares? Right? That really is an important issue. So I'm not expecting her to say things. I just get these two signs, and there's this idea that something is buried that's surfacing, and then there is this gulf between what she has endured and what other people could even begin to understand if she told them. And so, like with Charlotte Delbo says, we were thirsty in Auschwitz, and I think, okay, well, I'll just have a bottle. I'm thirsty now, but thirst in the order that you would drink muddy water, you would drink urine, because you are so thirsty. This takes us to the edges of things where we who didn't survive, who didn't experience it, are afraid, because if somebody told you that, you would probably be revolted, right? And I mean, the same is true of parents not telling their children, because things were done to human beings that someone couldn't bear to even dare to remember that it happened, and yet they are forced to remember it because, as Delbo says, it's like written in the skin. So I think it's not so much that she could ever have said what her experiences were, but what I'm trying to convey to you, which is that it is written in some sense in the flesh of that work. And if you listen to this silent scream, as it were, of the work itself, you are getting a work that is not monumental testimony, right? But actually is struggling to, as it were, to fight against and find a form, and then cannot withstand, as it were, the pressure, and then finds, in a sense, a deformation that becomes as eloquent in its anguish to what it is. But I don't think there is any way that trauma isn't something you can tell somebody about. It's not. It's of an order that has no words and has no image. At the same time, people struggle to, as I was saying, that sort of find some syntactical narrative form that can maybe contain some of the traces of it, slowly relieve you of the pressure of it. But I think in her case, she just said, no, I won't talk about it, I won't say anything, it's behind me, and yet that's why I think what the Charlotte Delbo gives us an insight into what it means to carry it at these buried levels, but at a level that might leak out and take on these forms that are acoustic or imagistic or sort of sensual. So she, like many survivors, she smiles, she tells you these things, she says, no, we won't talk about that. But you have to listen to the work. That's my point.
You show us, thanks for a very interesting lecture full of possibilities. I found very interesting that you show us the dead body by Holbein in an horizontal position. It reminds me of the painting by Mantegna in Milan. You've probably seen, very horizontal. And I found interesting that you always make a distinction between the horizontal and the vertical and the oblique. I found interesting that, as Shakespeare said, as soon as we are only when we are born, we are old enough to die. Do you believe in, you show also some paintings by Dutch of the resurrection. Do you believe in a reincarnation of the body? And if is that the case, do you think he will be reborn in a vertical or horizontal position? Also, final things, you were at University of Leeds. I was there once, and if I'm not mistaken, the elevators in the building, they go on forever. You just walk in and never stops. Is that the case? You remember that?
I do, and I can't remember what they have a special name because they are like paternosters. That's right. Yeah, no. Health and safety made them impossible because people could fall jumping in and off, etc. So they have been abolished. So yes, those were a memory. It's very interesting you should raise this because I was recently a visiting professor in India, and I was taken to all the great monuments of the Mughal emperors, from the 16th century onto the 18th century, and all their monuments are tombs. And all of them are these wonderful structures in order to have absolutely horizontal tombs, okay? And so I thought to myself, this is very interesting, because obviously Muslims bury the dead, Hindus burn the dead. And so I was very fascinated by this entirely different imagination between the sense of the body that must be preserved, even monumentally preserved by these great things like the Taj Mahal laying over the bodies of royalty, and the dispensability of the physical body in Hinduism, which of course relates to the idea of reincarnation, that you don't need this body, you're not the one and only, you are going to inhabit other bodies at other times. And obviously that's very different from the sort of Christian image, because the Christians now struggle, as indeed the Jews do, with the question of cremation, the Jews for different sorts of reasons. Jewish law requires you to be buried absolutely in your uniqueness, so no false teeth, no nothing, you have to be washed, and you go back to the earth in the same pristine state as you were born, with nothing, no additions and nothing different from what you actually had when you came in. And obviously, but Christian life has the notion of the resurrection of the body. I don't think Jewish thought resurrects the body, and I'm not even sure that Muslim thought resurrects the body, but you just have to preserve it just in case. So I think it's what I find very interesting is when we are so afraid of religion that we have art and we don't want to talk about it, but actually what I'm saying, the different ways that people imagine these fundamental conditions of the difficulty of thinking of a living thing which has consciousness not being, right? Death is one of the most defining things for human beings. We know we're dealing with a human culture. When we do excavations, we know it's a human society when we find some death rituals. When you don't throw mummy and daddy on the, grandpa or grandmother's bones on the midden with all the, yesterday's lunch, when you find them with conch shells or, laid in some position, people, archaeologists will say this is clearly a human society, and this is the division. So the question of what we do with the limit of human life is one of the most crucial things, and you can see human life exists when we have to think, well, if this is an organic limit, what happens to this bit of us that keeps thinking? So the idea of resurrection, or the idea of life after death, underworlds, afterworlds, repeated recyclings of worlds are incredibly important. But what I'm suggesting is that when we look at the legacies of Auschwitz, we are forced to confront, and this is an Adorno position, something really happened to real bodies that almost in a sense knocks out the metaphysical, the imaginative speculations that have informed our concepts. And there's a famous thing where Freud says to his mother what happens after death, and she just rubs her hands and says, okay, see that? That's it. Dust. You will be nothing but dust. There is no point. So radical atheists say, well, okay, that's it. I will be dust, no problem to thinking about this. But I still think we can't imagine death. So reincarnation is one way of saying there will be no death, it'll go on an endless cycle. Entombment is another way of saying it. The pharaohs had another saying, okay, I've gone into the sky and become a constellation. But we face a sense that something happened to all of that imaginative resources as a result of what really happened in the 20th century. And that's still our obligation to think it through. And I think certain of these sculptures, this particular formal shift from that to that, which we see in Alina Szapocznikow, so takes us to that area of reflection. And it takes it to us to it formally and by means of its own aesthetic ambitions and dissolutions. So maybe on that happy note of reflecting on death, I can leave it.